too much? Did I try too hard to preserve your touch, to deserve your heart? Ring the midnight bells at noon, baby, I will be there soon. The wind, it sings a brand new tune for you, for you. Now the sun comes up from across the sound, and the boats head off to the oyster grounds. Ring the midnight bells at noon.
That's what maximum effort looks like. That's that shucking and talking. I don't know, I just love it. This is my oyster eating shirt. I can't eat oysters without it.
It's just that they bring you such a connection to the sea. It's that oyster, when it's harvested, a week later, that shell is still closed, the animal's alive, and it's still living in that same water that it was harvested from. So if it's coming from as far away from Florida or Canada, you're transporting that part of the world right to where you're eating it at that time.
The southern New England coastline is heaven for oyster lovers and for the people who harvest the bivalves from the sea. The protected Long Island Sound, the fresh-flowing rivers, and the broad estuaries provide nearly ideal conditions for oysters to grow and multiply.
Oystering is so important to Connecticut, both historically and now. It's part of our maritime heritage. For many people, it's part of their culture and tradition. We gather buckets of oysters. It's just a really exciting part of who we are.
People in Connecticut take oysters seriously. Many love to eat them. Restaurants and bars love to serve them. And politicians love to brag about them.
I love oystering because it's a feeling of freedom every morning. When you leave the dock, you untie, you're floating, you're making your own way out there. I think it's the freedom of the job. When you come upon a bed of shellfish, clams, or oysters that you weren't expecting to find, those are the best days you could ever have on the water, I think.
I like the boats and I like the fresh air and the water. I don't like storms. I like water that's like just a foot high.
Oyster people love the oystering life, but it's not easy. It brings hard labor, harsh winter conditions, storms, long days on the water, and for the crew, in slack times, the paychecks can be skimpy.
My favorite part of oystering is staying out on the water in sometimes challenging and adverse conditions. I kind of prided myself, especially with the Robert Murray boat that I ran, being able to stay out when everybody else was going in.
I suffer from numerous ailments. If you looked at my chart and looked at a used car, you probably would not buy this car. On the other hand, I also feel that in some ways it's kept me hard and healthy, and I think that being outside and making my living outside in many ways has been good for me.
I don't know, it's like a way of life, or like the work never stops. I always say, if you go from the start to the finish in your lifetime, you end up making a good living through the hard years and good years, because it is a 3-year crop. So if a storm comes through and wipes us out, we got to work for 3 years until we start making it again.
The oyster is a biological linchpin for the Long Island Sound ecosystem, and farming of oysters actually amplifies their positive impact. Dredging cleans up the grounds and helps the oysters thrive.
Oysters serve as this filtering system for the entire sound. And so as they're feeding on algae, they're actually removing particles from the environment. They're cleaning, they're filtering, they're clarifying the water.
Oysters eat algae and phytoplankton that are produced in excess by the overuse of fertilizers and by summer warming of harbor and estuary waters. At the same time, the purity of the oysters themselves must be safeguarded. The state routinely tests water, the meat of the oyster, and plankton and algae for bacteria and toxins.
The state of Connecticut has a great program on testing the waters, knowing what's out there, so it's protected. Like up in the Quinnipiac Harbor and Norwalk Harbor, we don't sell those oysters out of there to market. We move them out into clean water. They'll spend 2 years out in certified clean water. But it is important to the farm, the inner harbors, because that's where our food is for the young oysters. You don't have the young oysters won't survive out in the deep water until they get bigger.
Oysters can also help provide habitat for other marine life and protection against sea level rise and shoreline erosion. A program at New Haven Sound School shows a way to boost both roles, making artificial reefs from concrete balls.
So this is a habitat restoration project, and that's our big goal. This isn't just about putting oysters in the water, it's about those other ecosystem services that oysters provide. They help improve water quality, and by growing on the reef balls, we get that three-dimensional structure that creates space for other organisms. Another added value of oyster reef restoration is the benefits of coastal resiliency. So in the face of climate change and rising seas, oyster reefs provide an important buffer habitat. They can act like a little break, helping reduce wave energy as it comes to shore, helps salt marshes grow, which are giant buffers to absorb wave energy, and hopefully by pairing the growth of oyster reef with salt marsh, we'll be able to match that sea level rise and reduce those impacts on our coastal communities.
Along the shoreline, oyster people have begun lifting their buildings ahead of climate change-caused sea level rise. Jonathan Waters and his daughter Emily raised their shop 18 inches.
Yep. That was
Not bad.
not bad. So now that we've taken the floor out, you can see where the water has come up, and you can kind of see that some of the high tide lines, so where these reeds are, there's sort of a couple lines of them. These are more recent high tides that we've had, which reinforces that's not very far below the existing floor. And so by raising it, hopefully we're able to stave this off a little bit.
By raising this building up 18 inches, we will be pretty much with sea level rise in 2050. We should be pretty much about where we are right now. Okay, so that'll work.
Terrifying noise.
It's probably at least 100 years old. I mean, at least. You got to remember that, it wasn't that long ago that this area, Stony Creek and the peninsula, it was quarrying, oysters, some fishing and farming. Change really was sort of slow to come here, but it's been accelerating recently.
There's a long history of oystering on the coast. Before the arrival of the Europeans, oysters were a major source of sustenance for Native Americans. Evidence of oyster harvesting by them goes back at least 12,000 years.
They actually collected by hand or used simple tools, like a wooden rake. Not only did they eat them fresh, they put them in stews and soups and stuff, but they also dried them and smoked them. So they could have them during the starvation times, which are late winter, early spring, where there's very little fresh food around. Oyster shells particularly, had more than an economic significance for Native people. There was a spiritual connection as well. In fact, the characteristics of shells in general, white, shiny, sometimes translucent, were metaphors for spiritual and social well-being.
Settlers from Europe relied on oysters too. They learned how to harvest them from the Native Americans. Small villages dedicated to oystering developed along the coast, and the industry thrived in New Haven's Fairhaven and City Point, and in Norwalk, Stratford, Milford, and Mystic.
So in the late 19th century, the oyster business boomed in Connecticut and Fairhaven. And Connecticut became central to the world for oystering. The growth of the oyster industry in New Haven in the 19th century coincided with technology, population growth, and the idea that the city itself was really a burgeoning place, really booming in a way that we can't quite comprehend. And an instrumental person in that was H.C. Rowe. H.C. Rowe was a man of his time, a man at the right place, kind of ruthless, and someone who saw the big picture.
Rowe was in the great tradition of business giants of his era. He was a huge risk taker at a time when no one was planting in the deep waters of the Long Island Sound. It was regarded to be untenable. He started proving that you could, in fact, propagate oysters in the deep water, and boy, he made it work. And he then followed up by engaging in the purchase of steam-powered dredges, which itself was a transformative part of the industry. At one point, of the 4 largest oyster steam dredges in the world, Henry C. Rowe owned 3 of them.
So in the early 20th century, the oyster industry went from being the largest in the world and a leader to declining rapidly. There were several factors involved with this. There's a growing city, massive industrial growth, the revolution behind it, and 0 environmental regulations meant you had filthy waterways, you had filthy rivers, filthy harbors.
The land and the water at one point had an enormous mutual prominence in America. The water was understood to be a major source of transportation and a major source of food. But as urban America developed and as all the progress enabled transportation to get food much further distances, much more quickly, we really began to start looking away from the water.
The business itself just dropped, the traditions changed, and it almost disappeared by the mid-20th century.
Over time, new environmental protections, controls on harvests, and restoration efforts led to a revitalization of the industry.
When we very first started, my uncle broke us in. It was in '73 that was going to be a real good set he saw. in the river here. And he'd come out with us and show us how to throw the dredge, feel how it was tending bottom by holding the line with your hand when you first put it in, see if it was floating or grabbing. You catch the best when you're towing into the current in this river. When the current's running out, you tow into it. We would use a hand line. At that particular time back then, we didn't have those winders yet. Well, once we got the dredge to tend right, and we were hauling up the oysters. We had what they call a culling board, so that we would dump the dredge if we could on the culling board, or if we dumped it right in the boat, then we'd shovel it up on the culling board, and we'd pick out the oysters and push over the shell. There'd be a bunch of boats that would come in at the same time years ago, and we'd help each other unload. Well, the wintertime, the river could ice over quite a bit, depending on how much snow we got and ice and how cold it got. When we first started doing this, we didn't have rubber gloves, so we'd had to use canvas gloves, and we'd put Vaseline on our hands before we put the glove on. Well, with my uncle's times, they used to have somebody called Obligable. And they called him that because a lot of times they couldn't understand what he was saying. One time, my uncle called his house. True story. And they were good friends. He says, I want to talk to Obligable. And she gives the guy's real name. And my uncle says, no, I don't want to talk to him. I want to talk, I don't think he knew his real name. I want to talk to Obligable. She hung up on him.
My father and uncle, they learned from a lot of the old timers, and they had a vision. They knew it would come back. So in the late 60s, 70s, they started sailing, Bridgeport beds, catching oysters, selling to the oystermen. And then they started buying up all these companies, and they put together a company called Talmadge Brothers, and they turned it into a fairly large company.
In 1973, a fire ripped through the Blooms complex in Norwalk. Employees took the lead in fighting the fire.
Started Norm Bloom & Sons probably around 94. Small boat, started working. My son Jimmy, he was probably around 10 years old. He was working with me, and a couple of guys, and we started building Norm Bloom & Sons, which we ended up building that where we had like 8 boats, and around 2001, and then that's when we started getting really big. That's when we got the bigger boats, and we got a bigger chunk of grounds, and that's when we really started to take off.
I always feel like an oyster has really 3 different layers of flavor. The first thing you taste is the sea that it grew up in. Next, I like to chew it gently. The idea that you just slurp an oyster down, that doesn't work for me. You might as well take a shot of salt water. When you break up that oyster, that's where you taste the body of the oyster. There's the last thing you chew is the hardest part of the oyster, the adductor muscle, and that's going to be the finish of the oyster. So in wine, we talk about terroir, where the different growing conditions create a different type of grape and a different flavor. With oysters, we're talking about merroir, where the different aspects of the sea that it's grown in are going to create changes in what you taste and the texture and the flavor of the oyster. The factors are going to be temperature, the food that they eat. There's different types of plankton that create different flavors in the oyster. Opening oysters is not a feat of strength. You never want to push the knife hard, you never want to turn it hard. When you push it hard, that's when it ends up going right in here, and that hurts. So I just wiggle it in here. You go into the hinge on this side. I wiggle it in, and once I get a grab, you'll see it slid in. Now just turn it, about 2 pounds of pressure, and the oyster will give up before you will.
Ring the midnight bells at noon. Baby, I will be there soon. The wind did sing a brand new tune for you. For you. dredge descending. Gloria, won't you land upon the bow and lead us home? Gloria, won't you stand upon the bow and lead us home?
I always try to do a thing I call seasons of oystering. You know, every season there's a different part going on in the oyster industry. Cops Island oysters, we farm in the wild. So we rely on Mother Nature.
The oystering year begins in the summer, when the water warms and oysters begin to spawn in the wild.
Then come July, that's when we get ready to start to put it in the water, because that's when the oysters are going to spawn. The water temperature gets up to like 70 degrees. So my son will watch it. When the spawn shoots out of the oyster, swims around for like a week or 2 weeks, and then when it swims back to the bottom is when we want to put the dry shell down. They catch a nice seed bed.
For a few days, it's a race against time. Crews work around the clock to move shell from the bank into the water so the larvae can settle on it. From late October through May, seed oystermen dredge young oysters from the public areas at the mouth of the Housatonic River, driving scows and using hand winches. Each day, buy boats travel to the mouth of the Housatonic to purchase young oysters from the seed oystermen.
Wait a minute, I gotta shave. Hold on, wait, I gotta shave. It's, you work in stints, but that's about close to 50 pounds. And you're pretty tired at the end of the day. If it's cold enough and there's several days in a row that are, below 20 degrees and there's not a lot of wind, you get real thin sheet of ice that goes right across the top of the salt water called skim ice. Our boats are wood. They're, 100 years old. It's like a knife edge, that thin razor's edge. All that hydraulic pressure as the boat's moving through the water, it can saw right through a boat. It could be the end of your day real quick.
Well, what we do in New Haven Harbor is we grow oysters, and we move it every year from lot to lot. We call it a 1,000 bushel an acre is what we put down. Now you put oysters down that are, say, a year old. Now in 1 year it'll grow in volume, so that 1,000 bushel becomes 3,000. So now you got to catch it up and make 3 acres, because if you don't do that, it'll start growing and choking itself. So we're like no different than a farmer on land. We need to turn our soil. We need to keep our bottom alive, fresh. If we just leave it, it'll cloud over, silt over, and die. So we do in New Haven, it's a lot of prep work for the market. So they'll move it. Now comes springtime. Now what I got to do is move the oysters out of the river, because I got to get that ready to put shell in July. So the oysters from the year before, it's like a checkerboard. I'll move them out further. Then I'll take the second year oyster, move that out a little further, and then I move the shell from last year out to the inner harbor. And we'll move the oysters around New Haven Harbor for probably a couple of years, and then we'll start moving it down to Norwalk. And that's where we'll start doing the marketing. The market goes on all year long, so that's separate from the farming part of it.
Cups Island oysters spend the last year of their lives in the Long Island Sound off Norwalk, where the water is clean and cold. In fall and early winter, crews vacuum shells from underwater storage lots and bring them to shore.
So we gathered the shell all year, and now we're starting to put it up on the beach up in Quinnipiac. And you'll see a big steel boat be running back and forth, and all that boat does is catch shell. It's a 100-foot boat. It goes to what we call shell lots. Bring the shell in, we put it up on the beach, and we dry it. So we'll probably spend another, maybe into February, and then we stop, this pile sits there, and it'll dry until July.
So traditionally, oyster farmers will put out culch and collect wild set. And so the purpose of the hatchery is to supplement that wild set. So if for some reason we don't get a large natural set, we always have something reliable with hatchery seed. So we bring in broodstock from our market products. So we bring in the oysters with the best traits that we want to perpetuate into the next generation. So we bring them up, we gradually increase their temperature, and then when they're ready, we will use a thermal shock, so we'll suddenly bring the temperature up even higher, and that will stimulate them to spawn. Once they spawn, we're able to collect the gametes from both the males and the females, combine them in a bucket, and within 24 hours we will have free-swimming oyster larvae. The settlement process is essentially them going through metamorphosis, so they go from a petty villager, which is a zooplankton stage, where they have cilia that they can swim. So once the larvae are in the conicals, they will stay there for about 2 to 3 weeks. They'll get a water change every other day, and we feed them different diets as they grow, depending on their size and nutritional needs. So they are there until they develop a foot and an eye spot, which indicates that they are ready to find their settlement place. We produce all our algae. We got starter cultures from various different places, and essentially what you're doing is you're just perpetuating that culture. They'll fill them with water, put the algae in, and then essentially give them all the things they need. They need light, they need nutrients, they need water. So they've got the water, we put lights behind them, they're just small plants, and we give them the nutrients they need, and they will grow exponentially, and when they are dark enough, we'll feed them to the oysters. So we have a gravity feed system for everything downstairs, so we drop all the algae through a line in the floor, and we can just bring it around. It's in a hose essentially at that point. We can spray it into each of the tanks that need it. What we do is we use an artificial culch, which is just crushed up oyster and clamshell, completely natural. It's essentially the texture of sand, but it's still calcium carbonate, so they're still attracted to it. So we put that in the bottom of a tray, and the goal is to have one oyster larva settle down onto 1 grain of this shell grit. And at that point, it will grow up completely independently from all the other oysters, so they'll be a very natural shape and size, and traditionally what you'd see on a raw bar.
The oystering life is hard. Rough weather, bulky machines, lots of heavy lifting. In the early days, men typically labored on the boats and women worked on shore, shucking, canning, and serving oysters. Today, women are in the hatcheries, in oyster farms, and on boats as well. Regardless of gender, traditional aspects of the culture continue to run strong, including a love for the outdoors, for problem solving on the fly, and for dealing with a mix of tasks. In this business, no 2 days are the same.
Yeah, I was practically born on the water. I moved out to the Thimbles when I was 4 years old. I guess in many ways that was the start of all this. As a child, I got into oystering mainly because the oyster industry, or the oyster business in town, E.S. Ball and Company, was still active. And I used to sit and watch these boats working in the behind the island.
I really don't remember ever wanting to do anything else. My parents' house was on Fort Trumbull Beach, and from a young kid out there at Charles Island, I always remember seeing these big wooden white boats with the arms coming up and down, and it was like, it was amazing to me. I could sit there for hours and watch those boats. I always wanted to get out to them.
I got into oystering in the early 90s. Primarily, I was on my brother's lobster boat as a deckhand, and while my 4 daughters were all in school. Then, for a while, I worked on the L&J oyster boat in the East River of Guilford. Oystering has changed drastically since I first started. First of all, back in the early 90s, there were very few oysters. They were scarce. As we did get more oysters, we did most of the culling and chipping on board the boats and bagging of the oysters. Now that's done in a refrigerated shop.
My first oystering job was selling seed oysters to Norm Bloom & Son. And I'd have to say that that was probably the biggest thrill of my adult life, was, catching my oysters on my boat.
He used to take me out, and it was interesting. He worked with this big bearded guy, kind of like in a cartoon. Like fisherman, you would think like, he had big arms. That's kind of the foggy first memory I have. I loved the water ever since then. And you just kind of evolve with it. You kind of become a fisherman. You're not, some people say like, oh, they're just born for it or whatever. I really don't think so. I think it has to cultivate you. It has to chisel you out of a block of stone.
So the first time I went out on an oyster boat was Thanksgiving when I was really little. Was going out with my dad, and I suspect my uncle, and we were getting oysters for Thanksgiving dinner here in the creek.
Well, Jimmy, he's probably around 5 or 6 years old. He found oysters down the end of the street. So he got a wagon, he had a little friend of his, Hector, and they used to go down there and they'd start picking oysters.
I guess I started with an interest in the business at a young age. Started going to work with my father and, took on to it from there. Had my first boat when I was about 9 years old. Go out by myself, I had a little dredge, pull it by hand. My father would be in the area and, keeping an eye on me, but basically, I would take the boat out by myself and harvest oysters.
I went to a marine science high school, specifically tailored toward teaching kids about the ocean, and also we had an aquaculture facility, so pretty soon after starting there, I decided I wanted to pursue aquaculture. And when I got here, there had been a hatchery previously, but it hadn't been run in, I think, about 10 years. So the materials were all there, but it wasn't functional. So
usually, but I just was.
Here we are.
When I got here, I remember, little, and 16 years old, and you come from it's different, down there it's probably 80 every day, all the time, all year round. When I got here, I remember I go with my uncle, start working the scout with my uncle, Carlo. And he started teaching me driving the boat, and start working with the guys or the crew. So I kind of know all the guys work over here, back from Honduras. So we got that relation, so it's more easy, to work with the guy.
I was given a chance by Norm Bloom and his brother to run a clam boat, but once in a while we did put a heavy dredge on the stern of the boat, and I would do like a modified Crazy 8 pattern, and we would get oysters for our New Haven location.
I mixed the arts and the oysters sort of through a appreciation of the visual aspect of the boats. I'm kind of creating a picture. In many ways, it's almost a painting, a realistic painting. This is an aspect of my work that I'm coming to realize that is so much a part of it, and that in fact they've sort of blended.
Unfortunately for me, there were some men out in the water that did not like me. It was apparent that they would rather not have me out there. And it was a challenge some days just existing with them. I just put up with it, never really complained. I didn't ever give up. And, you know, after a while, they just left me alone. Unfortunately, there's nobody you can call for sexual harassment out on the water.
Patty works mostly on shore these days. She sells shellfish in New Haven's Fairhaven neighborhood.
The oyster industry is predominantly male. I don't have specific stats, but certainly it's rare that I come across another female oysterman, or an oysterwoman, I guess, as it would be called. I think there's a very just logistical issue. It's kind of hard to pee off a boat if you're a female. It's a lot easier for the dude. I grew up a tomboy. I've always been around guys. There's a comfort there. I don't mind it, being sort of the only woman. Honestly, it's one of those things I don't really think a gender barrier is real there. So once you're on the water, it doesn't really matter.
The best thing about this job is that every day is different, and it's very practical and hands-on. There isn't a hatchery store where you can buy anything that is specifically designed for what you're doing, because every hatchery is going to be completely different. So by virtue of doing this, I've learned plumbing and electrical and all those sorts of things, engineering. I've had to do lots of math, which is a surprise.
To know all the secret, like you say, you gotta be in a you gotta be in a boat. You gotta be in a every day, you know, in the water. So you start to know where how you gotta drive the boat, how fast, you know. You look in the bottom, you know, in the GPS. You know where the better spots for working. Because when somebody asks you where is the best spot, we never say, you know, we say, oh, over there, you know.
The oyster business had been here in the Thimbles for since the 1700s. You know, it was a historic venture, and that interested me on another level. That I was restoring and keeping alive a business that had been here for you know, a couple hundred years. Started in a in a small scow, 24-foot scow that I built. I guess the biggest year we had was something like 15,000 bushel. I had 3 boats working. There were 3 crews.
Art Dolan, who was one of my bosses, plus a dear friend, was leaning up on the exhaust of the Robert Marie with his down jacket on, and he didn't realize it, and it started to burn, and the feathers were flying out all over the place. And he said to the other deckhand, "Oh, she's so bad. She hit a damn seagull."
To be able to, you know, share the work experience with my son, I really feel like it's a blessing. It's not always easy. You know, he probably talks back more than someone that wasn't my son does, but I feel very blessed to be working with my son.
You know, am I going to be a fisherman the rest of my life? You know, I'm really not sure. I could be. Now, I am, in a way, in love with this job, but it's kind of like a bad girlfriend. And, you know, you kind of want to get away from her, but you love her. Do I want to do something else? I mean, there's a lot of things I want to do. You know, I'm not educated, but I know a lot of things, and there's a lot of things I would like to do. it's, money's always an obstacle. The reality is that, I probably will end up be out here.
The future of oystering right now looks very bright, especially for our company, with a hatchery in works in Noank and partially in Norwalk and a big facility planned for New Haven. I think even when Mother Nature does fail us, which that will happen sometime with a huge hurricane or a rainfall, the hatchery will supplement that. And, I'm very excited to be part of it.
I am really trying to set this up for, the next 20 or 30 years, and so that it'll continue after I've gone. I mean, there are lobster pots here. There's a railway. There's boats are up. There's a Viking boat being built by guys cutting it out of live oak. There are boats being restored. Fishing is going on and off the dock. This shop and dock and the rail and the boats and the activity are iconic to this area and are very important to this area.
So as someone that has a quote-unquote real job that I have to clock into 9 to 5, so to speak, working as a teacher, I found that I really want to be on the water more and do more oystering. During the height of COVID, it was amazing to be able to step away from screen teaching and get on the water and get out. And I'm finding that I really want to do that more and more.
My son, who's 5, about to be 6, has taken an interest in the business. He comes out with us on the boat and loves doing it. He loves being on the boat and doing the work. I hope he takes on the family business and follows in my family's footsteps. I'm the 3rd generation, so my son will be 4 generations.
In the early days, the European Americans harvested oysters from dugout canoes. But eventually, craftsmen in New Haven began building Sharpies, flat-bottomed sailboats that got into shallow water and held a lot of oysters.
A Sharpie is a long, skinny, and most importantly, very shallow draft boat. It can get to the grounds very easily where the oysters grow, and in shallower water. Using a biology analogy, a Sharpie is a crustacean. It has no skeleton, which makes it immensely easier to build. All you're doing is building the shell, and then you're done.
Jonathan and friends are restoring the Tiger, a weather-beaten sandbagger sloop, which was modeled on boats used for oystering in the 19th century.
The Tiger is a historic sailing oyster boat whose design is from the 1870s. There are very few of these boats left. I think that it's important to keep this in front of people's faces because it's a large part of our history here. I think it's important to keep that present in people's consciousness.
Jonathan has built all or part of several boats, including the Merlin, his current oyster boat, and the Emily, which he named after his daughter. He does the work at his dock in Stony Creek.
When I first got started, I ran a Brockway scow, and he was notorious along the coast as a boat builder. He just used AC plywood, knocked these things together with roofing tar and nails. Earl was a bit of a character. He had patches of roofing tar stuck to his bald head. He had on a blue terry cloth bathrobe, no shirt, pair of jeans, and 2 different kinds of shoes on. In order to move the scow, he backed his old Cadillac up against this tall oak tree that was in the center of his yard, hooked up the cable to the rear bumper, ran the cable back over to the scow, hooked it up, and then proceeded to drag the scow through all the other boats that were in front of it. It was the damnedest thing I'd ever seen.
Norman Bloom pulls all of his wooden boats out of the water each August for repairs and maintenance. A key element is caulking, using traditional methods and materials.
What we do when we caulk a boat, what we call it corking, we put in cotton first, long strands of cotton. You tuck them up, you make little loops, you tuck it up, you put it in the seam, you drive it in tight. Now the cotton is what really stops the leaks. You put oakum on top of the cotton to protect the cotton so it doesn't wash out of the seam. Then you put regular flat weight paint, you wait till that to dry, you put the seam compound in, it's just good to go. They have pictures on vases of Phoenicians for like 4,000 or 6,000 years ago, and they're poking the seams the same way that we do now. So it really essentially hasn't changed in 4,000 years at least.
Flanagan Brothers Boatyard is one of the last places on the East Coast that still repairs wooden oyster boats.
We specialize in wooden oyster boats. I like wooden oyster boats, mostly because you can go at it with a sledgehammer. And if you're a frustrated person, just come to work with me. I'll hand you a hammer and you can beat on stuff all day long.
Right now, Brian is restoring the Grace P. Lowndes, a 90-year-old oyster boat that operates along the Connecticut coast.
Well, that boat there has got a little history with us. I mean, my father ran it. I ran the boat. My son Jimmy was running it. And like I say, the boat was built here in Connecticut. So it kind of means something to us. We really want to keep that going.
So on the Grace P, we started out with replacing the ribs, but we got about halfway down and I had to hold up the cabin and replace what held up the poop deck. And then we continued replacing ribs until we got to the back end. Then I had to rebuild the back end, the stern, and now we're putting planks on. When I get the planks back on and the deck is all done, then we have to put the whole inside of the boat back together. We have to put all the tanks back in that we took out, all the bulkheads back in, all the ceiling back in. Then we have to finish the cabin. So it's been a big job. I mean, it's been a pretty big job. All right, so this is one of our most important tools. It's a ship saw that tilts. It tilts while you're cutting, so you can cut a plank that is twisted and curved. You can make just about anything on that. You end up losing body parts usually. My great uncle had, I think, 2 short fingers. I've been working here 24 years, 23 years, and I think I'm the last one. My kids aren't really into it. I don't know. I might have to find somebody to train up. Pop says you have to grow your own help, but it hasn't worked out for me yet. I haven't grown any that want to take over. I don't think they're building any more wooden oyster boats. I've been being told my whole life that it's the end of an era, but I'm still at work.
I like to eat them raw in the half shell. They're my favorite. I know people like to cook them and top them, but there's nothing like having an oyster right out of the water.
It's a medium briny, it's got good body, and the finish is almost sweet. The adductor muscle almost tastes like a scallop on these. Oh, it's so good. And
yeah, usually when I go out, I never bring them home. But every once in a while down here, I'll shuck a couple if I get hungry, or I'll go out to eat them.
You know, I like them. I like them every way. You know, I like a stew. You know, on a cold winter day, there's nothing quite like it.
My aunt found a real good recipe. The best one she had was she'd broil them. She'd get it like a third of a strip of bacon, roll them first in Italian flavored breadcrumbs, put the strip of bacon around them, put a toothpick in it, and broil them on both sides. The bacon was partly raw, you know, when it was done. I could eat 2 or 3 dozen like that. I can't eat them raw like that. I could eat a few raw, but like that, I could eat 2 or 3 dozen.
My favorite way to eat an oyster is just raw with either a lemon, maybe a little minuet sauce if we're feeling fancy.
My son, he's allergic, so he can't even be around oysters. Yeah.
They're, you know, they're the ultimate fast food. You know, they really are. They come in their own package. You know, you keep them cold. They're, you know, they're just perfect. Yep.
Gloria, won't you land upon the bow and lead us home? Gloria, won't you stand upon the bow and lead us home? Lead us home. Lead us home. Lead us home. Lead us.
Well, that was incredible. Thank you so much, Steve, for sharing that with us.
Thank you.
Great. Jonathan, hopefully you're here with us as well. I think I saw that you were when I was looking through. So here's what we're going to do now. We've got about 20 minutes for Q&A. So if everyone could put it in the chat, we'll read that back, or Steve, you can read it and answer any questions that anybody has.
If it's okay, I'd like to kind of set the table by talking about the film. Would that be okay?
That'd be perfect. Thank you so much.
Okay, all right. So this film came out of a group I was involved with during COVID. Actually, at the start of COVID, a group of people kind of came together virtually and ultimately called themselves the Pivot Project. And the idea was that COVID was a wake-up call that we're not living sustainably and we really have to change the way we're operating. And out of it actually came two films that Scott and I did. The first was A River Speaks, which is about the Mill River and about the complex relationship between humans and the rest of nature. And while walking along the Mill River to discover, everything I could learn about it, I actually was riding my bicycle across the Tomlinson Street Bridge, and I got stuck on the other side, and I looked down in the water to see what was coming through, and I saw these two wooden boats kind of bucking in the current. And I wasn't, they looked like anachronisms, like something, ghost ships from another time or something. But it turned out they were oyster boats. They're two oyster boats that are berthed along the Quinnipiac there. So that's really what led to this film. And I put, as I was making, I put little pieces of it out on Facebook, and Chris Bousquet, the singer-songwriter, saw it and said, "Oh, here's this song I wrote about an oysterman. You can use it." The Gloria song, and it's just perfect. It really sets the tone for the film. It really makes the film. And then people also told me, you should talk to this person, you should talk to that person. And somebody said, you should talk to Jonathan Waters. And so I did, and I really have enjoyed getting to know Jonathan a little bit, interviewing him, seeing him a few times at his place in Stony Creek. And I really think he embodies the essence of the oyster person, of the oysterman. And plus he's got this whole other thing of being a really good artist at the same time that kind of gives him an extra dimension that most oystermen don't have. But anyway, I wanted to, if Jonathan, if you would have any kind of comments about, the oystering life and appreciating it and whatever you want to say, that'd be great.
Jonathan, I think I see that you're muted. If you want to unmute, that would be great.
Is that better?
That's better. We can hear you now.
Yeah. Well, I just, I hadn't seen this film in a while, Steve, and it was great to view it again, and just how much I enjoyed it. Reliving some of those moments, and I also want to just say that the Blooms business is just an amazing, wonderful thing, and they've really done a lot. I mean, just so much to keep this going in a big way.
Steve, how long did it take you to produce this?
Took over a year, partly because remember when Norm Bloom talks about the seasons of oystering? It is 4 seasons, though some things go on throughout it. So I really wanted to follow it from beginning to end. And I really wanted to tell people how it's done in step by step. I've told other audiences that by the time you finish this film, you know more about oystering than 99.999% of the people in the world. I think that's probably true. And I'm just fascinated by how things work, how they get done. So,
I think the boats too were so impressive, and you just did such an amazing job of being able to show, what you need to make this happen, and really showing people that young and old, that hopefully this is going to continue. I'm so impressed with it so much. I hear Jonathan speak a lot, but Jonathan, what is your feeling on the future of oystering? I think it seems so like it's got such a great future, really.
Yeah, I'm bullish on it. I think that I know Emily. I kind of represent, in a way, the older, tradition, but M's really embraced the cage culture, and I think that probably will be a factor in the future, that more people will be growing their oysters, perhaps a more controlled setting. It's if you don't have a lot of oysters, it's a good way to do it because you keep track of the ones that you have.
Yeah. Yeah. We do have some questions in the chat. Susan Schultz says, can you explain the drying on the Quinnipiac shore from February till July? And that's about the shell. The shell is gathered, different outfits gather shell in different ways, but the people at Norm Bloom and Son gather shell all through the year that doesn't have oysters in it, or they don't like pick it so that every single one doesn't have oysters, but they kind of have shell that they reuse every year, and they pile it in the Sound right off of Lighthouse Point before the breakwater. There's a huge pile of it, and all year they're putting it there, and then they start bringing it in and they put it on the shore, and they do it in the wintertime so it won't be so smelly. They don't start earlier than that, but because the neighbors complained. So it's put there, and then it's in those huge piles, and then when the oysters start spawning, when the water hits about 70 degrees in the Quinnipiac and other places, in the harbors and estuaries, the oyster larvae are up in the water column, just swimming around, start enjoying the early days of their lives. And so they put the shell down, and the oysters can settle on a nice solid piece of shell. Because there's a lot of mud in these rivers, and oysters don't like, they go down in mud and they die. So this is why they do that, and it's a magnificent thing. People have told me that oyster pile is worth, I don't know how much money, but a huge amount of money, because you don't think of oyster shells by themselves being worth a lot, but because of the service they provide in this process, they are really valuable. Jonathan, I didn't see, do you have a shell pile?
Yeah, we've got a small one now. We used to, back when I was going stronger there, we used to buy clamshells out of Rhode Island, sea clamshells, and we get triaxle loads. And then the sculpture lot, I don't know, we plant 10 or 15,000 bushel shell a year, loaded on the barges, bring it out and wash it off with the boats, and it works. It's really, the shell pile is kind of the foundation of the cultivation of the business, the oyster. So it's really it's a good place to start.
Yeah. Do you seed oysters up in one of the rivers? Which one is it?
Yeah, we're getting Jarvis Creek and Hoadley Creek and Stony Creek. A lot of my oysters in the old days used to come from the West River in Guilford. I would transplant the seed oysters from there grow them out in Stony Creek, and then market them. And when I started, there really wasn't going on, and but they've come back with a vengeance now. It's a lot.
Very good.
It's really, it's really great to see.
Steve, do you see there's a couple more questions too?
There's one about the Native Americans. Does that mean that American oysters predates oystering in France and Brittany? I know that there's evidence of Native Americans harvesting and eating oysters going back 10,000 years in New England.
Definitely.
I don't have the comparable number for France and Brittany. They have different techniques over in Europe. It's also a different species of oyster. The entire east coast of the United States is one species. The size of them depends on nutrients and water temperature. I was down in New Orleans about a year ago, and we had these oysters. I swear they were like 8 inches long, and they were, you open the thing up, it looks like a hamburger. So they were a little scary, but they tasted good.
Yeah, feed a family of 4.
Yeah, right. Right. And let's see, there's another question.
The education.
Where does one get the education to work in the hatchery? I do not know, but that young woman Danielle did it at UConn, I believe.
Yeah, you can in Bridgeport. There's a aquaculture school there, and probably a good way to learn it is just to go help out in a hatchery.
Right. Or start at the sound school, or
yeah.
I think Mystic Groton or Mystic have a aquaculture school as well. But yeah, I think that makes sense, work in a hatchery. I thought she was so impressive. Oh my gosh, Steve, that was a great interview.
Yeah, Danielle was really good.
Yeah.
The fact that they said they hired her and she read a book.
Right, I love
and she put it together.
Yeah. She said engineering, math, she using all the different subjects to work there. It's just incredible.
No, she was a really marvelous young person.
So every time you watch this, you must just get, you see something different every time, right?
Well, I've seen it a few times.
I bet.
Some of my films, like the first one we made was called The Village, Life in New Haven's Little Italy. I've probably seen it 50 times since it was produced. I cry every time. Some of these things. This one doesn't make me cry, it makes me smile.
Yeah, right. And you're working on something right now, aren't you? I know I haven't know where you are, but
yeah, you might be able to tell from the decor. So I'm in a town called Valladolid, which is in Mexico's in the Yucatan Peninsula, right in the middle of it, and I'm making a film about the Maya. It's an indigenous group throughout Central America and Mexico, and the Maya in Yucatan have remained very cohesive. There are hundreds of villages that are Maya villages here, and indigenous people around the world have been, destroyed by colonization, genocide, diseases. Globalization is a big threat, but there are hundreds of villages here where at least the older generation still speaks Mayan. And so it's a look at that and about, how are there lessons about resilience in this for other indigenous people, or even, people like us, So it's fascinating. I've been here for 2 weeks and we're shooting, Jonathan probably understands. We are a very small operation. We take no money, and we spend every film we made until this one. We spent less than $1,000 to make it. So we try to, we have to shoot everything here in 2 weeks. So
in 2 weeks, wow.
Correct.
And where will you distribute that or air that?
Same idea. We show it. the films at film festivals. We do it at museums, libraries, churches. Two of the films, the short version of the oyster film, which is called Oyster Heaven, has been on PBS last year, and our film A River Speaks is going to be on PBS in March. And I have high hopes for this, this film about the Maya, because I think there's a lot of attention and interest and new respect for Indigenous people these days. So I'm hoping that will actually be distributed PBS nationwide. The other two have been Connecticut and a little bit of Massachusetts, that kind of thing. But we have dreams of grandeur.
Well, congratulations. I mean, we've been the recipients of your gifts to us here in Connecticut. And I just can't thank you enough from the Stony Creek Museum and Jonathan,
Jonathan, thanks so much. Yeah.
Thanks so much. Guys. Yeah. And I honestly, thanks to everyone who joined in tonight. This is like a little bit different format. We do these quarterly, and our next one is in April, and we'll be sending that out to everyone. So we're looking forward to that as well. But Steve, have a great time down there, and you're lucky you missed about -4 degrees here.
I know, my timing was fantastic.
Sure is. So
all right.
Thanks everyone for joining us on behalf of the Stony Creek Museum. We'll see you soon.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yep, good night.
Good night.